Hello, welcome to everyone who has joined us today. My name is Robyn Short, and you are joining the State of Conflict in the Workplace webinar. And I am running solo today, so I'm having to let folks into um, the room while I'm talking. So please forgive me as I multitask a tad bit here. So the state of conflict in the workplace webinar today, what we're going to do is share with you the results from a survey that we deployed recently. We deployed this in October, and the survey was open through March. And the reason that I conducted this survey is because those of us in the conflict resolution space have been really relying on data from a kind of old survey, an old study from CPP Global. This was done in 2008. It's really the most comprehensive study that has been done in as it relates to exploring how much conflict there is in the workplace. Because the data was obviously pretty old, I was really curious to get some updated data, and I couldn't find any. So I created a survey. Many of the questions are similar to the CPP questions because it was a great study, and I was really interested in updated data on some of those specific questions. I included some additional questions as well. So we got about 60 people who responded to our survey, and these 60 people ranged from um, uh, frontline workers, managers, middle managers, senior leaders, and executives. So we had a really good range of people who were participating in terms of positions and their line of sight into the workplace. But with 60 people who surveyed, I would not call this a comprehensive study. I would call it a snapshot, kind of a peek into the window of what's happening in our workplaces as it relates to conflict. But in terms of like validating the data, I went back and looked at how our data compared to the CPP study from 2008 and was intrigued to see that not a lot has actually changed. Our data was really on point with what CPP found in 2008. Now, something that I did do is asked a couple of questions about type of workplace. Are you working remotely? Are you working hybrid? Are you working in the office? This data that you're going to see today is representative of all results. But over the next several months, I'm going to be producing a couple of reports that's going to slice it up a little bit differently so that we can see how what's happening in a hybrid workplace might be different than what's happening in a fully remote workplace. So those of you who have registered for this webinar, you will automatically get a copy of those reports when they come out, and they'll kind of be trickling out over several months. So as you can see from this screen, my name is Robyn Short. I'm the founder and CEO of Workplace Peace Institute. And my role in the organization is primarily as organization systems design consultant. That's what I do the most, the biggest portion of my job. People typically reach out to us when they're experiencing a lot of conflict in their workplace, and they're looking to really understand what's at the root of the conflict. So I will do culture studies, really comprehensive audits to really understand what's at the root of how people are showing up in the system from a systems design perspective. I also do leadership development training and coaching. I come to this work as a mediator, so through conflict resolution and peace building. I work as a DEIB consultant. And hopefully what I am accomplishing in my work, what I'm really passionate about, is supporting people in actualizing their own human potential. So this webinar series, the New Paradigm Leadership Educational Series, is brought to you all through our actual Leadership Academy, the Workplace Peace Institute Leadership Academy. Our courses are designed to optimize competencies in human behavior, communication skills, conflict resolution, DEI, so that we can all create really engaged workplaces where our basic human needs and our dignity needs are honored. Everything that we do at Workplace Peace Institute is through the lens of peace and dignity. So here at Workplace Peace Institute, we are singularly focused on supporting leaders in creating workplace cultures where all people thrive. So the journey that we're going to go on today in terms of our learning is to take a look at the impact that conflict actually has on us at a human level. We want to take a look at what it's costing organizations, what the conflict that's happening in our workplaces is actually costing in lost productivity, what leaders can do to be more effective in engaging in conflict, and some conflict resolution strategies, and of course, why all of this matters. I apologize that I'm going in and out with my computer here. My mouse doesn't work to let people in when I'm in play mode. So I apologize if that's a little irritating. So I want to offer a definition of workplace conflict. Workplace conflict is a state of discord that that happens when we have an actual or perceived opposition of needs, values, and interest between people working together. So in the CPP study, they define conflict as anything that stops the production of work, but I personally think it's a bit more nuanced than that. It's when there's just opposing needs around values, and that I'm trying to get my interests met. I'm trying to align my work to the values, and it's in contradiction maybe to someone else's. So I want us to take a look at who is actually having where is conflict showing up the most in workplaces? So although conflict exists at every level of an organization, it's most prevalent between different levels of management. So we see 32% of respondents said that they're seeing the most conflict between different levels of management. We also see conflict happening between line managers and their direct reports, kind of equally between senior leadership and executives. But what's interesting is that when we start to get into peer-to-peer level, we actually see less conflict. So you can notice that there is something happening once we get into hierarchy as it relates to where conflict begins to surface. So what is the human impact of conflict? What actually happens to us at a human level when we experience conflict in the workplace? There are some negative impacts. So 82% of people agree that when there's conflict, emotions run high. What is interesting to note about that is that as humans, we are feeling creatures who think, not thinking creatures who feel. So when our emotions are running really high, those emotions are actually driving our cognition. We are making decisions based off of our emotional experiences and not the other way around. And most of us in this room have probably made decisions in a really emotional state and didn't find that it was the best decision. So it's important to note that there is a very direct correlation between conflict and what that's actually happening inside the human body. So when people have seen conflict in the workplace, 88% have witnessed that this really has a direct impact on the way employees feel. It impacts morale negatively. 55% have experienced personal attacks. I will say that when we witness personal attacks happening in the workplace, there's a very direct correlation to psychological safety and maybe even our own sense of physical safety. 48% have experienced bullying behavior as it relates to conflict. Bullying can be extremely destructive to the human psyche and also to our physical well-being. So it doesn't just impact our mental well-being, it impacts our physical well-being. As you can see from that next statistic, that 45% of people have experienced sickness or absence as it relates to conflict in the workplace. Some people ultimately end up to leave the organization, and a significant number of people have seen that conflict causes a project to fail. That can be extremely costly. I was in an organization many years ago, about 10, 15 years ago, where there was an enormous amount of conflict between senior leaders, and it ultimately ended up costing them a $500,000 project with a client because that conflict was beginning to sort of leak over to the client experience. So it impacts us at a physical level, at an emotional level, at a mental well-being level. And when projects start to fail, it can also impact us individually at a financial level, because when projects fail, oftentimes people are let go. And conflict can have a really negative impact on how we feel, how we're showing up in the workplace. Many of you are probably familiar with Gallup's State of the Global Workplace report. In 2023, they reported that 77% of the workforce is disengaged. And I think that we can look to how conflict in the workplace impacts us to really begin to understand that number. 32% of people say they feel demotivated when there's conflict in the workplace. 28% begin to feel angry or frustrated, and 53% feel stressed. So what happens when we feel demotivated? What happens when we feel angry and frustrated? What happens when we feel stressed is we begin to sit in a defensive posture. Instead of leaning in with curiosity, instead of leaning in to explore how we can be, problem solvers and can be supportive of solutions, we lean out and we protect ourselves. And that causes disengagement. So there's a there's a definite through line to the amount of conflict that's happening in the workplace and how engaged your employees are in the workplace, which obviously has a significant impact on productivity. So there's 10 triggers that were identified for workplace conflict. So if you want to reduce workplace conflict, you need to increase capacity in these 10 ways. 73% of respondents said lack of trust in the workplace is a trigger for workplace conflict. Personality clashes, people simply not getting along and not having the mindset or the capacity to set their personal differences aside. Lack of role clarity is a very big one. This is also another piece that really surfaced in the 2008 CPP survey. When people simply don't understand the depth and breadth of what their job is, it can increase a lot of conflict because everyone has different ideas about what a person's job is. So having clear and updated job descriptions is so important. Those of you who are in HR in this webinar are probably thinking, yeah, that's kind of obvious, but it's surprising how many small organizations actually are operating without HR, and far too many times in those scenarios, the employees are operating in their roles without updated or without any job description at all. So role clarity is really important. Workplace stress obviously creates a lot of conflict, and stress actually has a physiological response on our body. When we are experiencing a lot of stress, we experience a lot of the cortisol hormone, and that hormone can increase adrenaline in our bodies, and increased adrenaline increases our desire to actually fight or our desire to freeze, meaning to kind of disassociate and not get involved. Both freezing and fighting are not healthy responses to workplace engagement. Obviously, heavy workloads play a big part in workplace conflict, and people's inability to just have peaceful, productive capacity for communication. So, destructive communication patterns play a big role in workplace conflict. Lack of team cohesion. And I think as we are operating more and more in hybrid environments and in fully remote environments, we need to be keeping a particular eye to team cohesion. The less we are actually seeing one another in the workplace, the less we are having opportunities to build real relationship, the harder it is to build a really cohesive team. Obviously, abuses of power, and it's not surprising to me that 47% of respondents says abuses of power is a trigger for workplace conflict, and the same number of people said that hierarchical decision making is a trigger for workplace conflict, because there's a very direct correlation between those two things. Now, that isn't to say that all hierarchical decision making will have abuses of power, but very often you will see abuse of power happening inside of hierarchical systems. And then a lack of adherence to mission and vision. I came into marketing communications, I'm sorry, I came into conflict resolution about 15 years ago from a career in marketing communication. And I will say that I have a deep belief that a mission and vision that really speaks to a person's that really calls people into a higher purpose is really, really critically important. When we have mission and vision statements that position us as the very best at something, include our organizational goals, or kind of include our service offerings, those actually aren't mission and vision statements that people know, feel very comfortable, or feel very inspired to get behind. They also tend to be mission and vision statements people don't even remember. So this lack of adherence to mission and vision also is connected to how much an organization's mission and vision really inspires the individual employee or worker, which will also have a direct connection to our ability to recall the mission and vision and to align our behaviors to it. So there are also positive things that happen when we experience conflict in the workplace. Some of those are that we have improved working relationships. So 57% of the people who responded to our survey said yes, that when conflict has been managed well, I have actually experienced relationships working better. It also can identify systemic weaknesses and vulnerabilities. So there's opportunities for system improvements. We also gain a better understanding of one another. And when conflict is managed well, it can absolutely lead to better solutions to a problem or to a challenge. And just as a lack of trust in the workplace can be a source of conflict, when we manage conflict in such a way that we're honoring the dignity of other people, we can actually build trust. So really good things can come through conflict if we have the skill to navigate it. So what is conflict actually costing us in the workplace? We asked some questions about how much time people spend dealing with conflict so that we could get to an understanding of a number. 15% say they deal with conflict every day. 28% say they deal with conflict frequently. And about half of workers are dealing with conflict occasionally. So it's a part of their life, but it's not a part of their everyday life. So on average, US workers are spending 2 hours per week dealing with conflict. Interestingly, and maybe sadly, that's exactly how much time we were spending dealing with conflict in 2008 when CPP did their global study. So we haven't actually gotten that much better at it. So we still have a lot of opportunities to improve in this area. So with this number of understanding how much time we're spending dealing with conflict, it can help us get to an average cost and lost productivity. So according to the Bureau of Labor, the average US annual salary is 59,384. That comes to an average cost and loss productivity of $3,216 per employee per year, year over year. So if we just look at an organization that has 100 employees, um, that organization is losing, or it's the cost and lost productivity is $321,633. So conflict is very costly. And you can do the math. You can look at your own organization and do the math to come to some ideas about what the average cost of conflict is for your organization. So with all this conflict, it still kind of surprises me that 72% of survey respondents report that their organization either does not have or they're unaware of a conflict resolution policy. So we're spending about 2 hours a week dealing with conflict, and we don't know what to do when conflict surfaces. We don't have any formal mechanism to actually channel this conflict through in terms of a process for navigating it. So the vast majority of workers just have no formal mechanism for managing conflict in the workplace. If we did, I think we would begin to see those numbers come down. So what are some considerations that leaders should be thinking about as it relates to conflict in the workplace and how we might be able to do things a little bit better? I wanted to get a sense of who people thought is responsible for managing conflict. So when managing surfaces, whose responsibility is it? Well, 70% agree that it's everyone's responsibility, that each of us need to be able to take responsibility for conflict engagement. And I 100% agree. But interestingly, 20% of respondents believe that senior executive leadership bears more responsibility than human resources. I agree with that statement, but it was a little bit surprising to me because of just our general ideas about what we think human resource does. So there's general agreement, we all bear responsibility, but leaders really need to be taking an active role in managing conflict. So with there being no conflict resolution policy or formal mechanism for navigating conflict in most workplaces, and since most people believe that we all need to take individual responsibility, we need to look at conflict resolution training. How do we upskill in this area so that we can all be more responsible and take more accountability of it? So 83% of respondents said, yes, we absolutely think that conflict resolution training is extremely important. And on some level, 98% agree that conflict resolution training is important. So almost everyone says, yes, we all need some upskilling in conflict resolution training. But I don't think that we're really getting the conflict resolution training that we need because it doesn't appear that we're very skilled at it. So when we ask participants to rate their manager's conflict resolution skill, 40% said they're not really skilled at all. 33% said, well, somewhat skilled, and only 27% are actually very skilled. So there is definite opportunity here for upskilling, and almost everybody thinks it's important. So we need to be prioritizing conflict resolution training and normalizing conflict resolution training in our workplaces. We asked how participants thought managers might be able to get a little bit better at managing conflict. And 82% of respondents said that we need to identify and address underlying tensions before things go wrong. One of the data points that I haven't included in this webinar and that I'm going to look at really exploring in detail in one of the upcoming reports was people's perceptions of the organization's conflict style. Does the organization tend to avoid conflict, compete when there's conflict, collaborate when there's conflict, or compromise? And the vast majority of the research responders said that their organization avoids. So when conflict surfaces, the tendency in the organization is to avoid it. And you can see here that people are saying we need to not avoid it. We need to be able to identify and address these underlying tensions quickly and get ahead of it so that things don't fester. We also need to be a model for the right behaviors. So when we look at that data point that says 20, while yes, 70% of us are, agree that we're all responsible, a good portion of people believe that leaders need to take a more active role. So we need to model the right behaviors. We need to be very intentional about providing more clarity over what's expected. I was just having a conversation about this actually with one of my colleagues yesterday, that oftentimes people don't provide the clarity that another person needs, really for I think one of two reasons. One, they're just conflict avoidant. They don't like having conversations that feel even remotely uncomfortable. And the other is it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to communicate all the information that needs to be communicated. So we think we're going to get to it. We never do get to it. And then the person who needed more clarity doesn't receive that clarity. And what humans do is we tend to fill in the gap. We tend to start making our own assumptions about why something is the way it is. So it's really important that we're very intentional about communicating clarity. I think someone mentioned one time, I'm hearing this quote of Brene Brown through someone else, but basically clarity is kind. We need to be very intentional in that way. We also need to grow our own coaching skills so that we can provide informal coaching to the people that we manage, really supporting people in their development and their growth and in their own problem solving so that they develop those skills as well, and so that problem solving is collaborative and co-created. We need to increase our capacity for managing difficult behaviors among employees. This is definitely something where conflict resolution training is very, very helpful in learning how to really lead and navigate difficult conversations effectively and successfully. We need to definitely increase our skills in leading diverse teams. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in another slide where we got a little bit more information around that. We need to not let our own egos get in the way. So that I'm going to touch on that a little bit more in another slide as well. Provide more clarity over areas of responsibility. So this connects back to that role clarity. And we need to develop mediation skills, not so that we can be real mediators in the workplace, but so that we can leverage the skills of mediation when conflict develops in the workplace. So these are, I'm not sure where the 10th one went, but so these are 9 ways that managers can address conflict more effectively. And we also need to grow our leadership intelligence skills. So when we look at this, 97% of people agree that emotional intelligence is essential for effective conflict engagement. Probably all of us in this room here today would say that the vast majority of people that we work with do not have exceptionally high emotional intelligence skills. So the more that we grow our capacity for emotional intelligence, the more we'll be able to tame our egos, which is one of those things that we need to really be able to focus on. And 98% agree that cultural intelligence is essential for effective conflict engagement. So that really touches on our capacity to effectively and successfully lead diverse teams. In the many decades that diversity and inclusion have been a focus in organizations. And I say that specifically D and I, because I think equity has only in recent years been entering into the equation. As we have been focusing on diversity, a lot of organizations have filled their candidate pipeline and been intentional about hiring a workforce that is very diverse without spending the necessary time, resources, upskilling, and awareness around creating cultural security in the workplace. So without cultural intelligence, as we increase diversity in our workforce, we can actually ultimately end up doing a lot of harm to people in the workplace because we haven't created a culturally secure or psychologically safe environment. So cultural intelligence is really critical to our capacity to navigate conflict in the workplace with dignity for people of all identity groups. So taking a look at conflict resolution and how conflict resolution training supports our ability to be more effective in our roles. So 83% of our research responders said that conflict resolution training does support role effectiveness, and yet only 65% have received conflict resolution training. So there's a pretty big gap in terms of people saying, yeah, this really does help me be more effective in my role, and I have or have not had the training. So people who say that they have had conflict resolution training say that they have increased comfort and confidence in handling conflict. So there's a very clear correlation between the upskilling helps me feel more comfortable and confident when conflict surfaces. They also feel like they are better able to advocate for their team, and it helps them to understand when and how to choose their battles. So when people go through conflict resolution training, what I often say when I'm doing trainings is we do not have to engage in every conflict that we're invited to. So it helps us to make some decisions around, is this the right conflict for me to actually engage with, or is it not that important? Sometimes avoiding something is the right choice, and training can help us get there in terms of making those right decisions. 35% have said that it has helped them get more positive outcomes for all the parties involved in the conflict. So that key word there is all parties involved in the conflict. So the training helps people begin to not just prioritize their own needs and their own interest, but begin to really seek win-win solutions for everyone. And conflict resolution training helped people know when to avoid and when to engage. So there's some connection there around knowing when to choose their battles. So, so people do kind of overwhelmingly agree that conflict resolution training is something that's very positive for their ability to be more effective in their individual roles. I also was curious to see how training actually led to changed behavior, right? So how we take this knowledge and then we really change our behaviors, do something different, and get another outcome. So 55% of research respondents said that they are more proactive in addressing conflict. So when conflict surfaces, they feel skilled, they feel comfortable, they feel confident to step in and engage. They don't avoid, they don't wait, they don't let it fester and get worse. They appreciate the value of conflict more than before. So when people go through conflict resolution training, they begin to recognize that conflict isn't inherently destructive and that there's a lot of positive benefits that can come from the conflict, and people begin to actually appreciate that. People also said that they began to follow a process or use techniques that they developed over time. So training helped them to kind of formalize or build a map for navigating conflict that they could draw on and come back to as necessary. And as they did that, they could improve it each time they used that toolbox of intervention skills. They began to seek advice from people outside of work. So training helps some people get more conscientious about seeking counsel, gaining other perspectives, applying some context to how they're going to engage and make decisions. People don't let it bother them as much, so they don't get as ruffled by conflict, which also means they're not disengaging from their work because of the conflict. And about 22% said that conflict resolution training helped them really focus on win outcomes. So looking for ways to really address underlying interest and make sure that everyone walks away feeling like they were really heard and that they were able to get what they were looking for in the conflict experience. So there's a lot of actual changed behaviors that surface when we have the opportunity to get some upskilling in conflict resolution. So what are just some strategies that we can look to help us as we're navigating conflict? We need to engage early. I think one of the most destructive things that we can do is let conflict fester. To engage early, we need to feel confident. We need to not have a lot of anxiety about it. We need to know that we have skills. We need to have that map that some of those research participants were talking about, that they've got some processes that they've been developing over time. We also need to develop conflict styles awareness. So what I mean by that is we need to realize that we all have a different approach to conflict. We all have a different pace in which we want to navigate conflict. And we all have different processes for how we like to problem solve, meaning some people like to collaborate, some people like to kind of problem solve in silos and then present their ideas to each other. So we all have different ways that we process information, and we need to have awareness that the way I do it might be very different from how the different individuals on my team do. So have awareness about that, and then also develop our capacity to be agile to that so that we're not imposing our own style on the conflict resolution process. We need to grow our leadership intelligent quotient. So it was abundantly clear from the survey results that people really think that emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence are very, very important. Last month, I had a webinar on dignity intelligence. I would also say that we need to really lean into growing our capacity for leading with dignity. And we need to develop competency in compassionate communication. And compassionate communication is a very specific model for communicating that was developed by a psychologist by the name of Marshall Rosenberg. Marshall Rosenberg also refers to this as nonviolent communication. And what this type of communication does, it's a very specific framework, but it's a framework that supports us in speaking honestly and speaking without judgment and listening with empathy. And it is one of the most transformative approaches to communication that I have ever encountered. And I actually want to highly recommend you all do some research and purchase his book. We need to focus on the problem and not the person. So oftentimes you'll read articles or hear trainings about how to manage difficult people. I don't think that people are inherently difficult. People are inherently different. And we need to be able to focus on the problem without shaming or blaming the individual, which leads me to this reality that I want us to all really hold as a truth, which is that humans are really complicated. And each of us are in various stages of our development. And we need to be really intentional about holding space for that when we expect everyone to be where we are in our development, to have our same level of emotional intelligence, to have our same level of cultural intelligence, to have the same skills we have in communication. When we expect people to be where we are, we can unintentionally violate their dignity. And that can lead to experiences of shame. It can lead to experiences of blame. And development rarely happens in those spaces. So we really need to be able to hold space for the reality that we're all in various stages of our development, and we always will be. Um, so why does conflict competency matter? Why do we need to really prioritize conflict competence? Well, one is that it increases our understanding of others. One of my mentors, Ken Cloak, often says, to ask ourselves, what would have had to have happened for me to behave that way? The more we're able to upskill ourselves and our workforce and our capacity to navigate conflict, the more we will actually be increasing our ability to understand others. And understanding is one of the essential elements of dignity. It's one of the ways that we really convey to people that they have worth and value, that we see it and that we honor it. Conflict competence increases trust. When we have skills in conflict, we know we can do hard things together. Something difficult surfaces and it doesn't scare us. We have this ability to lean in because we trust one another. I know I won't be harmed in this process, even though it's hard. So obviously it improves our working relationships. It supports us in better solutions to problem solving, and therefore improves team performance. And all of this increases our motivation. So those of you who have, who read Gallup's State of the Workplace report year over year, like I do, you can see all of these things are the things that are necessary to increase employee engagement in the workplace. So something that I want to leave you with is that conflict is inherent to the human condition. We are not on a goal to avoid conflict, but rather to navigate it with peace and dignity. If we avoid it altogether, if our goal is to make sure there is no conflict, we will actually miss out on the benefits that conflict has to offer us. And as humans, wherever we gather, there's going to be conflict. So we really just need to we need to gain more skill in our ability to navigate it. And we need to do that while holding a space for peace and dignity. So we have some courses at Workplace Peace Institute that support people and their capacity to grow their leadership intelligence, to grow their capacity for compassionate, mindful leadership. I think in the world we're living in today, part of being conflict competent is also being trauma informed. So we have courses on trauma informed leadership. We also, of course, have a series of courses on conflict engagement and a series of courses on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Any amount of conflict resolution training that we do will be helpful, but I also believe that our conflict competence is a journey. It's not a destination. The more we learn about conflict resolution, the more we learn that we have more to learn. So I really want to encourage you to embark on this journey of growing your own conflict competence and supporting that among your teams.